The gentle hum of the jet engines filled the cabin as Dr. Malcolm Davis settled into his seat. His broad shoulders, usually squared with confidence, sagged slightly under the weight of exhaustion. 2 weeks of pro bono surgeries in an underprivileged community had left him drained but fulfilled. Malcolm's fingers traced the worn edges of his medical journal as he gazed out the small oval window. New York's skyline faded into the distance, a reminder of the world he was leaving behind. A commotion near the front of the plane caught his attention. A middle-aged white woman with perfectly coiffed hair and designer luggage was gesticulating wildly at a flight attendant. "I specifically requested a seat in first class." The woman's shrill voice carried through the cabin. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The flight attendant, a petite brunette with a name tag that read Sarah Bradley, maintained a polite smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is fully booked. We've given you the best available seat in business class." The woman huffed, her eyes scanning the cabin with disdain. Her gaze landed on Malcolm, and her lip curled. She leaned towards another passenger, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "I can't believe they're letting people like that fly business class now." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes fixed on his journal. He heard worse, but it never got easier. Sarah guided the woman to her seat, which happened to be a few rows ahead of Malcolm. As she passed him, the woman's designer bag accidentally knocked against his arm. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I didn't see you there." Malcolm looked up, meeting her gaze with calm dignity. "No harm done, ma'am." The woman's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his articulate response. She quickly turned away, muttering under her breath as she took her seat. Sarah approached Malcolm, her eyes filled with apology. "I'm so sorry about that, sir. Can I get you anything to make your flight more comfortable?" Malcolm smiled, the warmth reaching his tired eyes. "I'm fine, thank you. You're doing a great job handling a difficult situation." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly at his kind words. She nodded gratefully before moving on to assist other passengers. As the plane taxied down the runway, Malcolm overheard snippets of conversation from nearby seats. "Did you see how that woman treated him?" a man's voice whispered. "Disgraceful," came the reply. "Some people never change." Malcolm closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voices. He'd learned long ago that dwelling on others' prejudices only led to bitterness. Instead, he focused on the lives he'd touched during his recent mission, the grateful families, the children with renewed hope. The plane lifted off, leaving the ground and its earthly troubles behind. Malcolm allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that soon he'd be home in Los Angeles, back in his own operating room where skill and dedication were all that mattered. His reverie was interrupted by a commotion a few rows ahead. The woman from earlier was demanding to change seats. "I refuse to sit near people like him," she declared loudly, pointing in Malcolm's direction. Sarah appeared again, her professional demeanor strained. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we can't accommodate seat changes once we're in the air. It's a safety regulation." The woman's face reddened. "Don't you know who I am? I'm Margaret Tillman. My husband practically owns half of Manhattan." A man seated near Malcolm leaned over. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you really going to let her talk to you like that?" Malcolm met the man's gaze. His eyes were kind, curious. "Sometimes," Malcolm said softly, "the best response is no response at all." The man nodded, impressed. He extended his hand. "John Harris. I admire your patience." Malcolm shook his hand. "Malcolm Davis. And thank you, but I've had plenty of practice." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden gasp from the front of the cabin. Margaret Tillman was clutching her chest, her face contorted in pain. "Help," she wheezed. "I can't breathe." Panic rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. Sarah rushed to Margaret's side, her training kicking in. "Is there a doctor on board?" Sarah called out, her voice steady but urgent. Without hesitation, Malcolm stood up. "I'm a doctor," he said, making his way to Margaret's seat. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition and fear as Malcolm approached. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak gasp. Malcolm's demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the tired traveler. In his place stood a confident medical professional. He knelt beside Margaret's seat, his hands moving with practiced precision as he checked her vitals. "She's having a heart attack," Malcolm announced. "I need the plane's medical kit and any aspirin you have on board." Sarah sprang into action, retrieving the supplies Malcolm requested. The other passengers watched in tense silence as Malcolm worked to stabilize Margaret's condition. "Ma'am, I need you to try and relax," Malcolm said softly to Margaret. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Margaret's eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Malcolm's. For a moment, the prejudice that had colored her earlier behavior vanished, replaced by the primal need for survival. She managed a small nod. Malcolm's hands moved swiftly, administering medication and performing life-saving techniques. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity to the watching passengers. Finally, Margaret's breathing began to stabilize. Color returned to her cheeks, and her grip on the armrest loosened. "She's stable," Malcolm announced, relief evident in his voice. "But she needs to be taken to a hospital as soon as we land." A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Sarah squeezed Malcolm's shoulder in gratitude. "Thank you, Doctor. You saved her life." As the initial crisis passed, Malcolm stood up, ready to return to his seat. But Margaret's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Wait," she said, her voice weak but clear. Malcolm turned, expecting gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, Margaret's eyes hardened. "I didn't ask for your help," she said coldly. A shocked silence fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged disbelieving glances. John Harris, who had moved closer to watch the drama unfold, shook his head in disgust. Malcolm's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of hurt passed through his eyes. He gently removed Margaret's hand from his wrist. "You're welcome, Mrs. Tillman," he said quietly. "I hope you have a swift recovery." As Malcolm made his way back to his seat, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Whispers broke out among the passengers, a mix of admiration for Malcolm and shock at Margaret's behavior. Sarah approached Malcolm once more, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Dr. Davis, I can't thank you enough for what you did. Is there anything I can do for you?" Malcolm smiled tiredly. "Just doing my job, Sarah. But thank you. I could use a glass of water, if it's not too much trouble." As Sarah hurried off to fetch the water, John Harris leaned across the aisle. "That was incredible, Dr. Davis. I can't believe how you handled that situation, both the medical emergency and, well, everything else." Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. "In my line of work, you learn to focus on what matters most, saving lives. Everything else, it's just noise." John's eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Your line of work? What exactly do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" Before Malcolm could answer, Sarah returned with his water. As she handed it to him, she couldn't help but interject. "Dr. Davis is being modest," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "He's not just any doctor. He's one of the top heart surgeons in the country. I recognized his name when I was checking the passenger list." John's eyes widened in surprise. "Is that true? And you just came from—" Malcolm took a sip of water, considering his words carefully. "I was in New York for a pro bono mission. There's a community there that doesn't have access to proper cardiac care. We set up a temporary clinic, performed some necessary surgeries." The admiration in John's eyes was clear. "That's amazing. And after all that, you still had the energy to save that woman's life, even after how she treated you." Malcolm shrugged, his humility genuine. "It's what I do. It's who I am." As the conversation lulled, Malcolm closed his eyes, the events of the past hour weighing heavily on him. He'd faced prejudice before, but rarely so blatantly and never immediately after saving someone's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that Margaret Tillman had recoiled from earlier were the ones that had just kept her heart beating. It was a stark reminder of the world he lived in, a world where his skills could be celebrated in an operating room, yet his mere presence could be deemed offensive in a public space. Malcolm's thoughts drifted to the patients he'd treated in New York. Their gratitude had been overwhelming, their joy at receiving life-saving care palpable. It was moments like those that kept him going, that reminded him why he'd become a doctor in the first place. As the plane continued its journey westward, Malcolm found himself at a crossroads. Part of him wanted to retreat into himself, to avoid any further confrontation. But a stronger part, the part that had driven him to become a surgeon, to volunteer his skills in underserved communities, knew that change only came through perseverance and compassion. He opened his eyes, gazing out at the clouds drifting by. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same calm determination that had guided him through countless surgeries and difficult encounters. Little did Malcolm know that his journey was far from over. As the plane cruised towards Los Angeles, fate was preparing to test his skills and his character once more, in ways he could never have anticipated. The cabin air grew thick with tension as the passengers processed what they had just witnessed. Dr. Malcolm Davis returned to his seat, his face a mask of calm professionalism, but his eyes betrayed a deep weariness. John Harris leaned across the aisle, his voice low. "I can't believe what just happened. That woman, how could she be so ungrateful?" Malcolm's gaze remained fixed on the seat in front of him. "It's not about gratitude, Mr. Harris. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the outcome." Sarah Bradley approached, her steps hesitant. She knelt beside Malcolm's seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Davis, I'm so sorry about Mrs. Tillman's behavior. I want you to know that we all appreciate what you did." Malcolm's eyes softened as he looked at Sarah. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your kindness." Sarah glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. "I hope you don't mind, but I recognized your name when I was checking the passenger list. You're not just any doctor, are you? You're that heart surgeon who's been doing all that pro bono work in underserved communities." John's eyebrows shot up. "Is that true?" Malcolm shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm just trying to make a difference where I can." Sarah stood up, a determined look in her eye. "People should know about this. They should know who you really are." Before Malcolm could protest, Sarah was moving through the cabin, speaking quietly to passengers. The atmosphere began to shift, curious glances and whispers replacing the earlier tension. John leaned in again. "Dr. Davis, I had no idea. Would you mind telling me more about your work?" Malcolm hesitated, then nodded. As he began to speak about his recent mission in New York, other passengers nearby turned to listen. "We set up a temporary clinic in a community that's been medically underserved for years," Malcolm explained. "Many of the residents there have never had access to proper cardiac care. We performed over 50 surgeries in 2 weeks." A woman across the aisle gasped. "That's incredible. How do you manage it all?" Malcolm's eyes lit up as he spoke about his patients. "When you see the impact it has on people's lives, on entire families, it's all the motivation you need." As Malcolm continued, more passengers gathered around, drawn by his quiet passion and humility. Even those who couldn't hear clearly sensed the shift in energy. Near the front of the cabin, Margaret Tillman sat rigidly in her seat, pointedly ignoring the growing crowd around Malcolm. But her body language betrayed her discomfort. Her shoulders tense, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Suddenly, Margaret's breath hitched. She clutched at her chest, her face contorting in pain. Sarah, who had been keeping a watchful eye on her, rushed to her side. "Mrs. Tillman, are you all right?" Margaret tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped in her seat. "Dr. Davis." Sarah called out, panic edging her voice. "We need you again." Malcolm was on his feet in an instant, pushing through the crowd of passengers. He reached Margaret's side, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he assessed her condition. "She's having another cardiac event," he announced, his voice steady. "I need the medical kit again, and someone contact the pilot. We need to land as soon as possible." The cabin erupted into controlled chaos. Passengers scrambled to clear space, while Sarah relayed messages to the cockpit. John Harris stepped up, offering to assist however he could. Malcolm worked tirelessly, his focus unwavering as he fought to stabilize Margaret's condition. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his hands remained steady. "Come on, Mrs. Tillman," he murmured. "Stay with us." Long minutes passed, the tension in the cabin palpable. Finally, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She gasped for air, her gaze wild and unfocused. What happened?" she wheezed. Malcolm's voice was gentle but firm. "You had another cardiac event, Mrs. Tillman. We're going to need to get you to a hospital as soon as we land." Recognition dawned in Margaret's eyes, followed quickly by a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, and something that looked almost like shame. The plane began its descent, the pilot's voice crackling over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making an emergency landing. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." As Malcolm prepared to return to his seat, Margaret's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Wait," she said, her voice weak. I'm sorry. For everything." Malcolm paused, studying her face. He nodded once, then gently removed her hand. "Let's focus on getting you the care you need, Mrs. Tillman." As the plane touched down, emergency medical personnel were already waiting on the tarmac. They boarded quickly, taking over Margaret's care. As they wheeled her out, her eyes sought Malcolm one last time, a mixture of gratitude and regret in her gaze. The other passengers began to disembark, many stopping to shake Malcolm's hand or offer words of thanks and admiration. John Harris lingered, clearly torn between leaving and wanting to say more. "Dr. Davis," he began, "I just want you to know what you did today, how you handled everything. It's inspiring. You've given me a lot to think about." Malcolm smiled, the weariness in his eyes softening. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I hope we all find ways to make the world a little better in whatever way we can." As the last passengers filed out, Sarah approached Malcolm one final time. "Dr. Davis, the captain would like to speak with you before you go." Malcolm nodded, following Sarah to the cockpit. Captain Roger Field stood waiting, his hand extended. "Dr. Davis," the captain said, shaking Malcolm's hand firmly, "I can't thank you enough for what you did today. You saved a life, twice, and handled a difficult situation with incredible grace." Malcolm shook his head. "I was just doing my job, Captain." "No," Captain Fields insisted. "You did far more than that. You showed us all what true professionalism and humanity look like. I've already contacted the airline. They want to upgrade you to first class for your connecting flight and offer you lifetime platinum status." Malcolm's eyes widened in surprise. "That's very generous, but it's not necessary, Dash." The captain held up a hand. "Please, it's the least we can do. And, if you don't mind, I'd like to share your story. People need to hear about this." Malcolm hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If you think it will help, Captain." As Malcolm finally exited the plane, he found a small crowd waiting in the terminal. News of what had happened had spread quickly. Phones were out, recording his every move. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Dr. Davis, can you tell us what happened on the flight? Is it true you saved a woman's life twice?" Malcolm blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the attention. He glanced back at the plane, thinking of Margaret, of the other passengers, of the long journey that had led him to this moment. Taking a deep breath, he turned to face the crowd. "Today," he began, his voice steady and clear, "we all witnessed the power of compassion and the importance of looking beyond our differences." As Malcolm spoke, his words carried through the terminal, touching hearts and opening minds. Little did he know that his actions that day would spark a chain reaction, leading to changes far beyond what he could have imagined, both in the lives of those he had touched and in his own. The story of the selfless black doctor who saved the life of a prejudiced woman would soon make headlines, challenging perceptions and inspiring conversations about race, compassion, and the true meaning of heroism. But for Malcolm, as he finished his impromptu speech and made his way to his connecting flight, it was just another day of doing what he believed was right, regardless of recognition or reward. As he walked away from the crowd, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the hospital where Margaret had been taken. They were requesting a consultation with him about her case. Malcolm paused, considering the implications. This unexpected turn of events could lead him down a path he hadn't anticipated, one that might force him to confront the very prejudices he had faced on the plane, but on a much larger scale. With a deep breath, Malcolm typed out a response, agreeing to the consultation. As he hit send, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey, one that would test not only his medical skills but his capacity for forgiveness and his belief in the power of change. The terminal bustled around him, oblivious to the internal struggle of the unassuming hero in their midst. Malcolm squared his shoulders and continued on his way, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with nothing but his skill, his compassion, and his unwavering belief in doing what was right. The sterile white walls of the airport medical unit seemed to close in on Margaret Tillman as she regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion etched across her face. The steady beep of the heart monitor served as a stark reminder of her brush with death. "Where am I?" Margaret's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. A nurse approached her bedside, clipboard in hand. "You're in the airport medical unit, Mrs. Tillman. You had another cardiac episode, but you're stable now." Margaret's brow furrowed as fragments of memory flooded back. The plane, the pain in her chest, and him. The black doctor who had saved her life. Twice. "The doctor," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "Is he?" The nurse's expression softened. "Dr. Davis. He's still at the airport, I believe. He wanted to ensure you were stable before he left." A wave of shame washed over Margaret. The weight of her actions, her words, her entire worldview came crashing down upon her. She closed her eyes, willing the tears not to fall. Outside the medical unit, Dr. Malcolm Davis stood in the bustling airport terminal, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. Passengers from the flight, airport staff, and curious onlookers gathered around him, eager to express their gratitude and awe. Sarah Bradley, the flight attendant, approached Malcolm with a warm smile. "Dr. Davis, I can't thank you enough for what you did today. You're a true hero." Malcolm shook his head, a hint of discomfort in his eyes. "I'm no hero, Sarah. I just did what any doctor would do." John Harris, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "But that's just it, Dr. Davis. It wasn't just what you did. It was how you did it. Your composure, your kindness, even in the face of, well, you know." Malcolm's gaze drifted towards the medical unit where Margaret was recovering. "We all have our battles to fight, Mr. Harris. Some are just more visible than others." As the crowd continued to grow, a commotion near the airport entrance caught everyone's attention. A group of reporters and cameramen burst through the doors, microphones and cameras at the ready. "Dr. Davis! Dr. Davis!" They called out, pushing through the crowd. "Can you tell us about what happened on the flight?" Malcolm's eyes widened, caught off guard by the sudden media attention. He glanced at Sarah and John, who both nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm stepped forward to address the reporters. "Today, we faced a medical emergency on our flight from New York. Thanks to the quick action of the flight crew and the cooperation of the passengers, we were able to stabilize the patient and land safely." A reporter pushed to the front. "But Dr. Davis, we've heard that the patient you saved had earlier made racist remarks towards you. How did you find the strength to help her?" The terminal fell silent, all eyes on Malcolm. He paused, carefully considering his words. "In medicine, we don't see color, creed, or background. We see human beings in need. My job, my calling, is to help people, all people, regardless of their beliefs or actions." As Malcolm spoke, a figure appeared at the entrance of the medical unit. Margaret Tillman, pale and unsteady, leaned against the doorframe. Her eyes locked onto Malcolm, a storm of emotions playing across her face. The reporters, sensing a potential confrontation, swung their cameras towards Margaret. Malcolm, noticing the shift, turned to see what had caught their attention. Their eyes met across the terminal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Margaret took a shaky step forward, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Davis, I—" Before she could finish, her knees buckled. Malcolm, without hesitation, rushed to her side, catching her before she hit the ground. "Mrs. Tillman, you shouldn't be out of bed," Malcolm said softly, supporting her weight. Margaret looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I said, everything I did. Why did you help me?" The cameras rolled, capturing every moment of this unexpected confrontation. Malcolm, aware of the audience, but focused solely on his patient, spoke with quiet conviction. "Mrs. Tillman, I help people because it's the right thing to do, not because they deserve it. We all have the capacity for growth, for change. Sometimes, we just need a chance to see the world differently." Margaret's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to Malcolm, her body racked with sobs. "I'm sorry," she repeated over and over. "I'm so sorry." The onlookers watched in stunned silence as this powerful moment of redemption unfolded before them. Sarah wiped away a tear, while John stood slack-jawed, witnessing a transformation he never thought possible. As Malcolm helped Margaret back to the medical unit, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The story of the racist woman saved by the black doctor she had scorned was already taking on a life of its own. Inside the medical unit, away from the prying eyes of the media, Malcolm gently helped Margaret back into bed. A nurse rushed over, checking her vitals and adjusting her for. Margaret's eyes never left Malcolm's face. "Dr. Davis," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve your kindness. I've been so wrong, for so long." Malcolm pulled up a chair, sitting beside her bed. "Mrs. Tillman, we all have the capacity to change, to grow. What matters is what we do with the chances we're given." Margaret nodded, tears still glistening in her eyes. "I want to make this right. I need to make this right, but I don't know how." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Start by looking inward, Mrs. Tillman. Question your beliefs, your assumptions. And then, when you're ready, use your position, your influence, to make a difference in the lives of those you've overlooked or dismissed." As they talked, neither noticed the figure lingering just outside the door. John Harris stood quietly, listening to their conversation. His phone was in his hand, the record button blinking silently. Outside in the terminal, the media frenzy was reaching a fever pitch. Reporters clamored for interviews with passengers, airport staff, anyone who could provide more details about the dramatic events that had unfolded. Sarah found herself surrounded by a group of journalists, their questions coming rapid fire. "Can you tell us more about Dr. Davis? What exactly happened on the flight? How did the other passengers react to Mrs. Tillman's behavior?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Davis is one of the most remarkable individuals I've ever met. His actions today went far beyond his duties as a doctor. He showed us all what true compassion looks like." As Sarah spoke, a commotion near the airport's main entrance caught everyone's attention. A group of protesters had gathered, holding signs denouncing racism and celebrating Dr. Davis as a hero. The atmosphere in the terminal crackled with tension and excitement. The story was growing, taking on a life of its own. What had started as a simple act of medical intervention was rapidly becoming a symbol of something much larger, a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle against prejudice and discrimination. Back in the medical unit, Malcolm's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it, his eyes widening as he scrolled through a flood of notifications. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, noticing his expression. Malcolm looked up, a mix of surprise and concern on his face. "It seems our story has gone viral. There are protests forming outside the airport, and—" He paused, reading further. "Several major news networks are requesting interviews." Margaret's face fell. "This is all my fault. I've turned your act of kindness into a media circus." Malcolm shook his head. "No, Mrs. Tillman. This is bigger than just you or me. Sometimes, events like these serve as a catalyst for important conversations for change." As if on cue, John Harris appeared at the door, a look of determination on his face. "Dr. Davis, Mrs. Tillman, I hope you'll forgive me, but I think you both need to see this." He held up his phone, playing the video he had secretly recorded of their conversation. Malcolm and Margaret watched in stunned silence as their private moment of reconciliation played out on the small screen. "I've already shared this on social media," John explained. "It's going viral. People are calling it a powerful example of forgiveness and growth." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling up once again. "Oh God, what have I done?" Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Mrs. Tillman, this is an opportunity to show the world that change is possible, that we can overcome our prejudices and become better versions of ourselves." As the gravity of a situation sank in, a knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. Captain Roger Fields entered, his face a mix of concern and admiration. "Dr. Davis, Mrs. Tillman," he began, "I'm sorry to intrude, but there's something you need to know. The airline CEO is on his way here. This situation has escalated beyond anything we could have imagined." Malcolm stood, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. "Thank you, Captain. We'll face this together." As Malcolm turned to leave, Margaret caught his hand. "Dr. Davis, Malcolm, I don't know if I'm ready for this." Malcolm squeezed her hand gently. "Mrs. Tillman, sometimes the most important steps we take are the ones we're least prepared for. But you won't be alone. We'll face this together, and hopefully, we can turn this moment into something positive, a chance for real change." With a deep breath, Malcolm stepped out of the medical unit and into the bustling terminal. The crowd parted as he walked, a hush falling over the onlookers. Cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for position. As he approached the bank of microphones set up near the airport's main entrance, Malcolm felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him or Margaret anymore. It was about something much bigger, a chance to address the deep-seated issues of racism and prejudice that still plagued society. He took his place behind the microphones, the eyes of the world upon him. As he began to speak, his words carried the power of his experiences, his compassion, and his unwavering belief in the potential for change. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, "today, we've all been part of something extraordinary, not because of any heroic actions, but because we've witnessed the power of compassion to overcome prejudice and the capacity for human beings to grow and change." As Malcolm's words echoed through the terminal and across airwaves around the world, a new chapter was beginning, not just for him and Margaret, but for all those who would be touched by their story. The airport buzzed with an electric energy as Dr. Malcolm Davis stepped up to the microphones. Cameras flashed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Malcolm's calm demeanor belied the turmoil of emotions churning within him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, "today, we've witnessed something extraordinary, not because of any heroic actions, but because we've seen the power of compassion to overcome prejudice." As Malcolm spoke, Margaret Tillman watched from her hospital bed, a small TV in her room broadcasting the impromptu press conference. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the man she had scorned just hours ago. "In our society, we often let our differences divide us," Malcolm continued. "But in moments of crisis, we are reminded of our shared humanity. Mrs. Tillman's medical emergency today wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving our collective soul." John Harris, standing at the back of the crowd, nodded in agreement. He pulled out his phone, typing furiously as he live-tweeted Malcolm's words. "The true measure of a person isn't in their mistakes," Malcolm said, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him. "It's in how they choose to learn and grow from those mistakes." Mrs. Tillman and I have both been given an opportunity today, an opportunity to show that change is possible, that redemption is within reach for all of us. In her hospital room, Margaret's sobs intensified. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. Back at the press conference, a reporter raised her hand. "Dr. Davis, How do you respond to those who say you should have refused to help Mrs. Tillman after her racist behavior? Malcolm's expression remained serene. As a doctor, my duty is to preserve life, regardless of a patient's beliefs or actions. But more importantly, as a human being, I believe in the power of kindness to transform hearts and minds. Sometimes, the people who need our compassion the most are those who seem to deserve it the least. Sarah Bradley, watching from the sidelines, felt a surge of pride. She caught Malcolm's eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. As Malcolm fielded more questions, a commotion near the back of the crowd caught everyone's attention. A group of people was pushing through, led by a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. "Dr. Davis," the man called out, making his way to the front. "I'm Richard Tillman, Margaret's husband. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Malcolm stepped away from the microphones, meeting Richard halfway. Richard's voice cracked as he spoke. "My wife just called me. She's not the same person she was this morning. What you did, what you said, it's changed her. Changed us both." Malcolm placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Mr. Tillman, change is a journey, not a destination. What matters is that we keep moving forward." As the two men spoke quietly, John Harris's phone buzzed with a notification. His eyes widened as he read the breaking news alert. "Dr. Davis." John called out, his voice cutting through the crowd. "You need to see this." John made his way to Malcolm and Richard, holding out his phone. The headline read, "Tillman Foundation announces major shift in policy. Will now accept and match donations from all communities." Richard's face registered shock, then a slow smile spread across his features. "She did it," he whispered. "Margaret actually did it." Malcolm read the article, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet satisfaction. He turned to address the crowd once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we're witnessing the beginning of real change. The Tillman Foundation, which has historically been selective in its donations, has just announced a new, inclusive policy." A cheer went up from the crowd. Reporters began firing questions rapidly, but Malcolm held up a hand for silence. "This is more than just a policy change," he continued. "It's a testament to the power of human connection. When we open our hearts to one another, when we choose compassion over judgment, we create ripples that can transform entire communities." As Malcolm spoke, Sarah Bradley noticed a familiar face pushing through the crowd, Captain Roger Fields. The pilot made his way to the front, a determined look on his face. "Dr. Davis," Captain Fields said, his voice carrying across the terminal. "On behalf of the airline, I want to offer you a lifetime of free first-class travel. It's the least we can do to honor your extraordinary actions today." Malcolm shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "That's very generous, Captain, but unnecessary. Instead, I'd ask that you direct those resources to providing medical transport for patients in underserved communities who need to travel for specialized care." The captain blinked, then nodded slowly. "Of course, Dr. Davis. We'd be honored to do that." As the press conference wound down, Malcolm found himself surrounded by well-wishers, passengers from the flight, airport staff, and even strangers who had been drawn in by the unfolding drama. John Harris approached, his phone still in hand. "Dr. Davis, your story is going viral. People are calling you a hero, an example of what America should be." Malcolm's expression turned thoughtful. "I'm no hero, Mr. Harris. I'm just a man who believes in doing what's right, even when, especially when, it's difficult." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah Bradley made her way to Malcolm's side. "Dr. Davis, your connecting flight to Los Angeles is boarding soon. Do you still plan to take it?" Malcolm glanced at his watch, then back at the medical unit where Margaret was recovering. "I think I'll stay a while longer, Sarah. There's still work to be done here." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll let the gate know. And Dr. Davis, thank you for everything." As the day wore on, Malcolm made his way back to Margaret's room. He found her sitting up in bed, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Dr. Davis," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to begin to apologize." Malcolm pulled up a chair, his expression gentle. "Mrs. Tillman, apologies are just words. It's our actions that truly show our hearts." Margaret nodded, a determined look crossing her face. "I want to do more, be better. I've already started with the foundation, but I need guidance. Will you help me?" Malcolm considered her request carefully. "Change isn't easy, Mrs. Tillman. It requires constant effort, self-reflection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Are you prepared for that journey?" Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "I am. For the first time in my life, I truly am." As they talked, outlining plans for community outreach and education programs, neither noticed the figure lingering in the doorway. John Harris watched silently, his journalist's instincts telling him he was witnessing something truly remarkable. Days turned into weeks, and the story of Dr. Malcolm Davis and Margaret Tillman continued to captivate the nation. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of compassion to bridge even the widest divides. Malcolm's pro bono work expanded, supported now by the resources of the Tillman Foundation. Hospitals in underserved communities received much-needed equipment and staffing. Medical students from diverse backgrounds were offered scholarships, ensuring a new generation of doctors would carry forward the legacy of compassion and equality. Margaret, true to her word, embarked on a journey of education and self-reflection. She became a vocal advocate for racial justice and equality, using her privilege and platform to amplify marginalized voices. 1 year after that fateful flight, Malcolm and Margaret stood together at the grand opening of the Davis-Tillman Center for Cardiovascular Health in one of New York's most underserved neighborhoods. As they cut the ribbon, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. John Harris, now a respected journalist known for his coverage of social justice issues, stepped forward with a microphone. "Dr. Davis, Mrs. Tillman," he began, "a year ago, you were strangers brought together by extraordinary circumstances. Today, you're partners in a mission that's changing lives across the country. What would you say to those who might be skeptical that such profound change is possible?" Malcolm and Margaret exchanged a glance, years of shared experiences reflected in that single look. "I'd say that change begins with a single act of kindness," Malcolm replied. "It's not always easy, and it's rarely comfortable, but it's always worth it." Margaret nodded, adding, "And I'd say that it's never too late to open your heart and mind. The journey of transformation is ongoing, but each step forward is a victory in itself." As the celebration continued around them, Malcolm took a moment to step aside, gazing out at the bustling New York street. He thought back to that day on the plane, to the fear and anger he'd seen in Margaret's eyes, to the moment he'd made the choice to help despite her prejudice. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. In the end, it hadn't been about heroism or recognition. It had been about staying true to his beliefs, about choosing compassion even in the face of hatred. And in doing so, he'd set in motion a chain of events that had changed not just 2 lives, but countless others. As he turned back to rejoin the celebration, Malcolm caught sight of his reflection in a nearby window. The man looking back at him was older, perhaps a bit wiser, but still driven by the same unwavering commitment to doing what was right. In that moment, Dr. Malcolm Davis knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more opportunities to choose kindness over anger, understanding over judgment. But he was ready for whatever lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that even the smallest act of compassion could ripple out to change the world.